Thank you, thank you. I'm going to try to give a presentation sitting down, which for me is very, I would say, annoying. I prefer when I communicate to walk and use my hand to convey some kind of a message. So this form of passiveness is very disturbing for me. Okay, I'll give it a shot about this passive way of presenting, because I also don't know which direction I should look at. Who's the most important person in the room? So I should look in this. Hi, Mom. Okay, just to warm things up a little bit. Okay, so when I was asked about this, and I said, oh my goodness, this is déjà vu all over again, because 20 years ago I was asked to write a book chapter about green logistics back then, which was back then some kind of a hot topic. And then when I was asked to do this, I reread, and I realized that my point of view have not much changed. And the situation is pretty much the same in some ways. That the bottom line remains that, of course, efficiency drives the logistic business. And sustainability or environmental greenness is some kind of a derived aspect of it. It's usually not the other way around. Although, of course, you could argue it should be the other way around. That should be this greenness. But when you look at the industry there, if I could say greenness is achieved, that's some kind of a byproduct of other strategy. And others are sometimes they're hypocrite. We're going to implement this strategy because we're green, but in reality, what they do is they want to improve their efficiency. The best example is, one of the best examples is slow steaming, which was sold as some kind of a green strategy. And of course, a lot of the maritime economists start to chuckle when we hear something like that. The reality is we have excess capacity. We don't know what to do with all these ships. We have a lot of... And let's find a way to absorb this and tell our customers that, so now we're going to be moving slower. And the way to make them accept this is just, it's going to be green. Yeah, bunch of hypocrite. So you have to be careful when you look at this. I have to be candid. You see a lot of hypocrisy when you talk about environmental sustainability and greenness. So you have not to fool yourself when you look at this. That obviously the debate is driven a lot, I would say, by this aspect. So allow me to move on here if this works. Yeah, I was a little bit confused. I was asked to present. It says it's an hour and a half session, and I was going to speak for about 40 minutes, but Alan told me, sorry, Jean-Paul, it's 20 minutes, so I'm going to speak much faster. Or I'm going to skip a lot of slides if you want to follow, to skip, or let's say to focus on what I believe is important in this debate, which I would say is a very, very confusing one. Because when you start to look at what seems to be happening, obviously, we've been talking about that for a long time, all these issues about intermodal, multimodal, and so on and so forth. And when you start to try to define them and try to find examples, it's really, really interesting in which way that because we're not moving faster, that we have to connect things better. And by connectivity, you improve this overall efficiency. And then there are different strategies. And there's some kind of confusion because what's the difference between intermodal and multimodal? Technically, it's the same. But the only difference is you have some kind of one contract. That's the definition. And when we talk about transmodal, there's no very effective definition about it. Just it's between effectiveness or connectivity within the same mode. And it involves very, very different strategy. I can give you some very quick example. Those are, going back. Of course, gateways, corridors are some kind of intermodal type of strategy. And wherever you look, you have those strategies in North America. You have those strategies in Europe to try to connect by enabling a transfer from maritime to inland with inland ports. All this modal shift, all of this is very well known. But what we don't talk too much about it, where actually a lot of action takes place, is, I'll skip the transshipment, which is also very interesting. It's that connectivity between different branches of the same system. And people tend to forget around the world these days when you connect different continents together and different networks, it's pretty not that common that you're going to get a point-to-point service. It's going to be, even with a maritime sequence, that is, you have places, you have major transshipment hubs that are emerging. And that's pretty interesting where they locate themselves. It's all about geography. In many ways. Now you can combine different networks. And finding data is very difficult. in many ways. I'm struggling all the time to find data about transshipment hub, about measurements about this. It's complicated, but you get some kind of a picture. And again, we don't talk too much about transmodalism because in the past it was mostly related only to North America, where we had some kind of a land bridge, which is essentially different networks that are interconnected at major hub. Actually, Chicago is one of the biggest ports in the world when you want to look at this from that point of view. And now the Chinese are coming in with their big transmodal system, trying to connect, and it's going to be a lot of fun. In a sense, because it's going to be technically the same mode, but how you're going to connect this large, long corridor is going to be a really, really interesting. But again, we'll see how they're going to do that overall. And again, just to go back a little bit in terms of, I start to look at what brought us here. I call it path dependency brought us where we are. That is, those are the decisions we made 50 years ago or so with the development of standards, for instance, a container, pretty much lock us in this whole system that we are today. There were discussions of years ago about containers not being the right unit, too small, or so on and so forth, about a 53-foot container. But there's a problem. We're so locked in that standard that everything, any planning, any further development, any debate about efficiency, sustainability, resilience, you want to think about this, is locked in this type of standards that we cannot get away from. I don't see how, in many ways. How we're going to get away from the 40-foot IQ container. I don't know. In North America, we tried a 53-foot, maybe. We have transloading, okay? But we're stuck. So all our future development are going to be based upon these form of limitation. And again, you want to read more about this, I explain all these steps, that each new decision is based upon the path dependency that was set decades or so ago. And go all the way back to the forklift if you want. And blockchain and all these things are simply an outcome of this path dependency. And there's something else which fascinates me as well. When you look at the big picture of supply chain, it takes place in a wider setting, which many of you have heard of. It's becoming almost a buzzword, which we call the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And the problem is people see that Fourth Industrial Revolution from their very narrow perspective. That is, what is going to be for maritime shipping? What's going to be for logistics? What's going to be for manufacturing? But when you start to put this all together, you start in some ways to be afraid. Because technically, so many aspects of the mode of operation are going to change, or technically could change, that the whole drivers behind supply chain management, particularly in terms of manufacturing, industrial location, all these issues of outsourcing, offshoring, which derives all this international shipping we're talking about, all these drivers are going to technically, potentially be modified in ways. So when I talk with the folks in maritime shipping, they love automation. They love it. Wow, we're going to improve our terminal efficiency and all these, wow, a self-driving vehicle, I love it. But I say, yes, but think about from a manufacturer perspective, what do you think it's going to do for them? They say, hey, I don't need no longer any cheap labor from China or whatsoever, so I'm going to rechange my industrial location strategy from minimization of labor costs to a maximization of market accessibility. So if you just change this perspective, a great range of locational strategy of manufacturing firm are going to evolve with this, and this changes a lot of the rules of the game. We might become much more sustainable as an indirect consequence of these strategies, simply because the supply chain is going to become probably shorter. That could be an outcome while we're not thinking about this. And you can implement all the policies, and this might be much more powerful in the greening of supply chains than anything else, just because we are now changing our locational behavior. Because we don't need that cheap input cost. And that's why globalization could have been just some kind of transition, just some kind of quirk, temporary effect where China and other countries in the world entered and create a massive transition while we move now to another transition. Again, I'm not too sure how far-reaching these impacts are going to be. But again, it's going to derive a sustainability and efficiency much more powerful in a manner, much more powerful than any type of technology and policy you can think of, in my opinion. Again, we can discuss about the true impact of this and so on and so forth. And this applies to everything, marketing, services. Wherever you look, You look about e-commerce, and it's destroying retail in North America. You made some back-of-the-envelope calculation, and we're going to lose about 40% of our retail space is going to disappear. It's going to be removed. The store is going to move to the warehouse. And the locational strategy of our warehouse is different. And now we're moving to city logistics, which could become another issue, which we did not see coming before. The number of parcels is growing at 15% per year. It's mind-boggling in that case. So I say people, they have concern about congestion in certain area because of retail. Don't forget about this. It's going to be something different. You're going to be actually an excess of retail space, space in central areas and cities if you let this process going on. So I find it that rather interesting as a way that things happens often at the margin. Again, that's the point I would like to make here, is automation changes processes. That's cool, that's neat. But from a geographer's perspective, automation changes locations. And locations, of course, is the core aspect of a lot of transportation, which is essentially a derived demand. We tend to forget about this. And of course, it's going to apply differently, and that's the whole point. In which way it's going to play itself on manufacturing, different segment, each supply chain will be different. So there's no framework exactly to mean that. And again, I wonder how now we're going to go back to classic Weberian location theory again. That could be the aspect where transportation costs was a very important factor. We could actually go back to this because at some point in time, these days transportation costs did not matter, and it led to all these issues that we're talking about today. In some ways, we talk about not much to do about nothing. In some way, the system will correct itself with this aspect. That would be interesting if it was the actual outcome. So that when I say here, greening is an elusive goal. And I start to look at all these green dimensions. Again, you can read the paper about all these strategies about material management, physical distribution. It's pretty well known in terms, there's a long shopping list of what you should do behind this. Forward and reverse green logistics. So people are talking about this. We talk about recycling. Again, this has been around for 20, 30 years, but doesn't seem to be much to be happening, surprisingly. That's interesting. We know the solutions, but the process or how to get there seems to be always elusive. Again, you implement policy, recycling. You implement, again, forced vehicle to use alternative fuels. It doesn't seem to be as effective as we expect. And that's the point. That's it. And then you had this new aspect, which is now pushed a lot by the World Economic Forum, among others, about all this circular economy. And I look at this and I cringe because, of course, it creates some form of different interesting form of reverse logistics, which are great, such as maintenance, reuse, remanufacture, recycle. It creates a very interesting nuance. But this strategy goes against any form of standard marketing corporate strategy today, which is linked upon fast product life cycle. And to implement such strategy, it is not necessarily the manufacturing sector that's going to need to change. It's the whole consumption mindset of the population that's going to be to change. So it's much more of a consumer behavior than anything else. And we'll see how far, because if a corporation push that, actually, it undermines its bottom line. And that's paradoxical. Sustainability, in that case, in logistics, goes against a lot of vested interest. And how do you break this down? How do you make this change? Again, I'm a little bit at a loss regarding this. Because it's all neat and so you read that, you say, yes, that's fine, that's cool, that's neat. Oh, we should all share products and so on and so forth. Yes. But you go to the bottom line, people want to have their own, they want to have their consumption at their discretion. So that's a really, really big deal, I must say. We have much more hurdle and we think about that. And again, it goes back to the balance between top-down and bottom-up. Classic. Should it come from the industry? Should it come from government policy? But in each side, it's dangerous. Again, Francois was mentioning this morning that a risk is government policy and especially the unintended consequences. It's always about unintended consequences. That's what actually, you have much more fun when you study policy and economics to look at unintended consequences than actually the expected consequence. That's usually what you observe, unintended consequence of this. And of course, if you let the industry self-regulate, you get Facebook. Okay? We have a lot of fun right now in the United States with this, and that you're not a consumer, you're a product, essentially, from that perspective. And in between, you have all these certification schemes which seems to be pushed forward as some kind of an interesting solution. We have to abide to some form of standards. And people are very enthusiastic about this. I'm very skeptical about it as well, I must say. But again, it seems to be the way to go. If you lead people together, eventually they converge towards some kind of a standard concerning what are the best practices. But the problem is these standards are constantly disrupted. And that's a problem. If we're living in a very stable economic system, it will converge toward some kind of optimal eventually, but those optimal are constantly disrupted by technological change. You constantly have to readjust, revise, and each time it is a very painful type of prospect. And that's, again, one of my frustration. The only way we're going to have this is when we have an economic system which has reached some kind of an equilibrium, and eventually all the actors could move. But as long as you put disruption in technological innovation, it creates those strong disruption that you have to adapt with, and always in some very unforeseen way, I must say. Again, I'm going to skip this, all the practices. Environmental management system, again, very fun, very cool, very neat. Doesn't seem to be very effective. But some are doing it. Again, in my paper, I compare EMAS and ISO. Very cool. But I start to read papers recently that firms, especially small firms, are starting to abandon these standards. They don't renew their license because it's a pain in the ass. Because they don't see much benefit, surprisingly, out of this. And I put a shopping list of what seems to be the case, of what would be the benefits, which are very difficult to demonstrate. They say they improve environmental performance. Yeah. Again, sometimes it's a matter of visibility. You just put the sticker on your trucks or whatsoever, and you go. It's a marketing scheme, I must say. And in some ways, it's one way to operate in a market, because the market dictates this, so you're going to abide to this standard. It's a kind of abiding to regulation becomes a kind of a competitive tool that others. But there's a cost. That's a problem. There's an entry cost behind this. And by undergoing certification, actually, you play only the game of some big players, and you actually undermine some smaller players. And that seems to be what seems to be the case, I must say. People say reduction in capital and insurance cost. Again, it yet remain to be formally demonstrated. That's not that clear, I would say. So what are the risks? Again, certification can be biased to protect some vested interest. As simple as that. Big players are going to say, okay, this is what you need, and they're going to influence the decision-making process. And you get yourself some oligopoly in that process, which creates very big barriers of entry towards the certification. That's also a risk I found towards sustainability. So because it's costly. And obviously, the auditing, the commitment process is beyond what many small and medium-sized firms can achieve. So that's a little bit of a paradox, that when you create certification, you create a barrier of entry. In theory, you create a standard, but each time you have a standard, it creates barriers of entries. And by doing that, it becomes a kind of a discriminatory process. So it has its advantage, but also it has its weaknesses. And I'm not sure how effectively we can work around with. And right now, it seems that EMAS, some firms are dropping out. Again, the evidence is, it seems that the number of firms are, especially, and when I look at what's dropping out, it's all the small firms, that they saw very limited advantage to this. So therefore, it's going to become some kind of a public subsidy for certification. That remains interesting. How much time do I have left? Okay, I'll move as quickly. I'm going to skip that. Talk about a little bit about blockchain, which gives me headaches, I must say. It's currently what I call in its bullshitting phase. That is, or more a more French word would be buzzword. It seems to be right now. It seems to be you start to read about it, and everybody says it's fantastic. It's going to create great opportunities, but nobody can tell you how. And I was very disturbed, and I started to put this together and start to try to understand myself from somebody who was, I would say, reasonably intelligent. And it took me hours just to try to figure out what were the principles. And when I start to realize that, I say, there's a problem here. If somebody who is familiar with the industry and the modal operation and so on and so forth has a tough time figuring out the concept, how it works, I can just imagine how difficult it's going to be the diffusion of this process. But overall, it does not change or put anything new. Nothing new. All the systems we have in the industry are blockchain simply replicates some of them, technically makes them more efficient. But it remains to be demonstrated. And I tell the maritime shipping industry, actually, I participated a few weeks ago a conference about terminal automation in London, and I say, do you really want to tell people how your sausage is made? By this I mean, transportation is based upon inefficiency and the capitalization of inefficiency, and supply chain management is the capitalization of inefficiency. That's why you make a profit. You make a profit on what does not work well. So if blockchain reveals this, you're in trouble. And that's a risk as well, because a lot of the trade, candidly, is illegal or gray. A lot of it. A lot of the trade is about how to undertake custom fraud, how to game the system, how to mislabel. If blockchain enables an industry that doesn't want to be too much transparent to become more transparent, that could be interesting. Again, we'll see. We'll see. That's for sure. But anyway, I understand the benefits. You start to put a list, increasing in velocity, that's for sure. Smart contracts are really neat. I'm very enthusiastic about that. An automation of resolution, because bill of lading are a mess. And just doing that will improve a lot of efficiency. Where a transaction, because maybe a sensor, it's scanned somewhere, it has reached a port gate, it has been loaded on a ship, it's been confirmed, and now because of that, a contract can be resolved. That could be really, again, I never thought about greenness. Again, I always assume greenness and will be a derived outcome of this. And that's my take on this. I don't see it the other way around. It has to be derived from these summation of improvement. I like that the visibility as well will be interesting. What I find interesting as well, could it create a market where people will be able to compete over a block? Say, oh, there's a block, I make it available for transport, it's a transport unit, and make it available in some kind of a Uber freight. That could be also very, very interesting. As I say, there's nothing new. It's like the container brought nothing new on global freight transportation. We could still move stuff by Galilean if you want to. But I think you understand but the efficiency itself that creates new business model. And that's where blockchain will be very interesting. If it applies well, it's finally going to enable us to actually measure the efficiency. Because it's very difficult with the tools. You can measure efficiency at a specific place where you can create that. But there, if you want an auditing process, a firm could say, I'm going to analyze your blockchain and be able to derive your carbon footprint. That's why right now I'm very, I would say, annoyed by product I put the carbon footprint because they're lying. Because we know about supply chain management, it could be routed in different ways, it could be sourced. So 1 year it could be sourced differently. So right now if you put a label, which something like that, you're essentially lying. But now finally with blockchain, if those have these transactions, you'll be able to scan this and do an automatic reporting system of what is the carbon footprint, the efficiency, because you are able to reconstruct wholly or partially the supply chain. And that's, in my opinion, going to be really, really interesting in that way. It might reduce the cost of certification. It might create even an automated certification process. Simply by saying, okay, you want to be certified, I'm going to analyze your blockchain. And because of that, you'll be able to demonstrate that you are compliant. And that might incite a lot of firms to move into the process. Because if I do that, I do all these smart contracts, this economic efficiency, but at the same time, I enable certification agency to do some forensic analysis on what I've done. And I think, again, I was talking about here digital intermodalism. That's going to be also very interesting. I try to decompose all the segment on an intermodal transportation, all the blockchain. That's really interesting. And I was asking, how can you game the system? And you cannot game the blockchain itself, but you can game the sensors, you can game the input, whatever you want. And that's also a little bit of a risk regarding this. But overall, it's I would say interesting. So question is, should we talk about efficiency or should we talk about sustainability? Again, my take, sustainability is derived. Sorry, okay? We can have a discussion about this or an argument, but it is derived. It's contingent upon something else. And that's, in a sense, when I look at this, the improvement are always a mess, or ad hoc, based upon opportunities, based upon disruption and changes, and the system adapts to it in the best efficient way. Environmental benefits so far when I observe in industry are always derived from other goals. Who claims something else is usually an hypocrite. Because very often, green logistics, if you're green but you're in the red, it creates brown logistics, if you understand the analogy here. Okay? It won't work. You cannot achieve that. You cannot be green while being in the red, in my opinion. So certification, of course, is interesting. It's some kind of natural tendency in the business. Circular economy is really interesting. However, a lot are going to have to change. And maybe some firms are going to enter this circular economy paradigm because they're going to perceive in a saturated market it's going to be the best way to compete. That is, since your growth of the consumption does not go up, the best way to now to put a new business is to now embrace this strategy. So it might be very good old Ford manufacturer going to be very proactive because they understand that's the only way I'm going to be able to achieve some market dominance into this. Again, never for the reason that you might believe, usually. And that's pretty much what I have to say about this issue today, in a sense. That, again, efficiency, sustainability is derived from anything else. And right now, we are on a verge of a very significant disruption from all the element of the supply chain itself, from the manufacturing all the way to the consumption pattern and behavior and all these aspects. Just looking at urban deliveries and e-commerce is mind-boggling in terms of the change and disruption that it is creating. From a classic, very well-designed massification of retail store to a very big box type of store, which is in many ways very efficient, to a distributed system of home parcel deliveries done on. We're not too sure which one is the most efficient in some ways, which one is the most sustainable. That remains to be seen.